team. She has a PhD from UConn, and she's worked as a contractor for us for a couple of years now in our Lead in Schools program. And we're really excited to have her here as a full-time employee on the compliance team. And one of her first, she started in the thick of CCR season, and she took that on and helped everyone with their CCRs and to maintain compliance. And one of the first, sorry, I muted someone. One of the first tasks I gave her was to create a webinar to help everyone understand the consumer confidence report rule revisions that we made this year to line up with EPA's regulation updates. So go ahead, Emma.
Oh, the lights just turned off on me.
That was bad timing.
sitting too still. So sorry, everyone. Good morning, everybody. Like Chrissy said, this webinar is to talk about the Consumer Confidence Report rule revisions that are going to take place starting in 2027 for CCRs for calendar year 2026 and beyond. And there'll be a section for questions at the end. So if you guys maybe just hold off until the end, because we might answer your question on our way through this presentation, but we will take questions at the end. So just a little bit up front about why consumer confidence reports are important. They came about through a 1996 amendment to the Safe Drinking Water Act. And in general, they summarize key information for consumers. So they're hitting the big ticket items like where does your water come from, what contaminants might be present in the water, how those contaminants might affect the consumer's health, and then what you guys as the systems are doing to keep drinking water safe. The timeline for these, like we all know, since we're all here for this presentation, we're going to have new requirements starting in 2027. And those requirements are going to cover report timing, delivery methods, record keeping, required sections and language, and there will be a new summary section as well. So timing. Systems that serve more than 10,000 people will need to distribute their CCR 2 times per calendar year. So there'll still be the July 1st due date, but there will be an additional December 31st due date. Both of those CCRs are going to include an annual summary of the previous calendar year. So they're both covering the same time period, calendar year, in this case for 2027, calendar year 2026. And the December 31st report should include essentially the same report that you turned in July, but any additional information, if applicable, that happened in the next 6 months of the year. Updates about violations, action level exceedances, or if you got any new unregulated contaminant monitoring rule or UCMR results. And that CCR in December is still required regardless of the presence of new violations, action level exceedances, or UCMR results. So even if you don't have anything to add, you'll still need to submit a second CCR to your consumers. That is not applicable for systems that serve less than 10,000 people. So systems that serve less than 10,000 consumers will still be distributing the report just 1 time per calendar year, and that will be due by July 1st. So there's no frequency change for systems that serve less than 10,000 people. Now, a couple updates to delivery methods. So systems have to directly deliver their CCRs to their customers by mail or an electronic delivery method. So that's a little bit of an update. Now, if you have an electronic delivery method that will reliably reach all of your consumers, you can use that delivery method to directly deliver your CCR. But if somebody requests a paper copy, you do need to provide that to them still. And then the second method, as usual, a good faith effort must be made to consumers who do not receive water bills. So some of the new good faith efforts that EPA has added include bulk delivery of postcards that have direct links to your report. If you have some kind of like text message or email system that consumers or people who consume your water can opt into, You can use that to notify people of the availability of the CCR. You can advertise your CCR on social media, or you could hold a public meeting to educate community members. But in addition to that, all of the previous good faith efforts are still accepted. So everything that we accepted up till now still works to meet your good faith requirement. We're just adding these other methods to keep up with, modern communication. As far as record keeping and certification, wholesalers need to deliver applicable information to consecutive systems by April 1st and October 1st if they are required to deliver reports 2 times per year. So as we said at the top, that applies to systems that serve greater than 10,000 people. In terms of record keeping and certification of your report to RIDOH, the privacy agency, you have to submit a copy of your report, the final copy, and the certification form to RIDOH no later than 10 days after the date of required distribution. So this is a big change from previous regulations to the new regulations. So for all systems, large and small, the reports that are due July 1st to your consumers are due both the report and the certification form to RIDOH by July 11th, which is 10 days after that July 1st due date. So that pushes back the due date of the actual report to RIDOH, but greatly accelerates the timeline of your certification. So previously your certification, like this year, not due until October 1st. Now they'll be due 10 days after the report was distributed, after the due date for the report to be distributed to your consumers. And then for those large systems that serve greater than 10,000 people, for the 12/31 due date of your second CCR, the due date for that copy and the certification to RIDOH will be January 10th. Systems that serve more than 50,000 people will have to post the current year's report to a publicly accessible website, and it needs to remain accessible for at least 3 years. That's a small change that won't affect very many systems in Rhode Island. So a couple things about report style. So in the past, you were required to use tables to display your results information. You're no longer required to use a table. You can now use a table or some other format that is clear and understandable. So that'll be sort of at the discretion of RIDOH when you guys turn those in next year. So that might be something, if you have questions, to communicate with us about. But essentially, you're not restricted to a table, but you can still use one if you'd like, but it needs to be clear and understandable. And there are a few new definitions that are getting added to the definitions section that's required in all CCRs. Those definitions are for contaminants, that's for all CCRs. There goes the lights again. And then pesticide and herbicide. Those get included if and when those terms are used in your report. And that language is in the regulations. I didn't copy it here just because reading a bunch of text is a little woo-woo, but you can find those definitions in the regulations. So in terms of translation and accessibility of the reports, in communities that have a large proportion of consumers with limited English proficiency, and I'll go into that a little bit more on the next slide, but the CCRs must contain information on where the consumers can get a translated copy of the report or assistance in the appropriate language. And for systems serving more than 100,000 people, they are required to develop a language access plan. And for everybody, systems must make a reasonable effort to provide the reports in an accessible format to anyone who requests an accommodation. A little bit more on that limited English proficiency definition. So here in Rhode Island, we're defining those communities as places where greater than 10% of the population, or at least 1,000 people, whichever is fewer, speak English less than, quote, very well. So the way we're making that determination is for local government unit public water systems using American Community Survey data. So a local government unit is any town, city district, commission, agency, authority, board, or other political subdivision of the state or of any political subdivision thereof that owns and operates a community water system within the state. So if that's something that you have a question about whether or not you qualify, that's something we can work with you to figure out. Then other community systems that don't fall into this local government unit definition, such as nursing homes and condo associations, must self-report the percentage of their population who don't speak English to determine whether or not they make that 10% threshold. Another new section that will be required starting next year is the summary section. So your CCR will have to start with a summary of key information at the beginning of your report. Some examples of key information are contact information for your water system, a description of the violations that are in your CCR, and if you included public notices in your CCR, a note that those have been included in your CCR. For accuracy and risk communication, there's some new revised educational material for nitrate and arsenic when the contaminant is detected between half of the maximum contaminant level, or MCL, and the MCO. So that's updated language in those specific circumstances where you haven't exceeded the MCL, but there are specific health effects that are required to be mentioned to consumers. There's updated standard language for the revised total coliform rule compliance, and systems must include a brief explanation of the reasons for monitoring for unregulated contaminants under UCMR. And again, all of the required language for these sections is included in the regulations. For lead in drinking water, there's some new information required for lead action level exceedances. They need to be clearly identified. An explanation of the exceedance must be included, and the report needs to include both a description of steps that consumers can take to reduce exposure to lead in drinking water and a description of any corrective actions the system has taken or will take. That's a similar set of information that you've historically been required to include for a violation, but now you're including that piece of information when you have a lead action level exceedance. And then you must also include language to explain your corrosion control efforts. And again, there's more information about that specific language in the regulations. So in summary, large systems, so systems that serve greater than 10,000 people, have to distribute their report biannually next year, once in July and once in December. There are new good faith delivery options that include things like social media. The certification is due to RIDOH 10 days after the CCR delivery deadline, so that is significantly sooner than was required this year and in previous years. There are new formatting options for how you display the data in your CCR, and there are new definitions and required languages in multiple sections of the CCR. There are also new translation requirements and RIDOH's new definition of who needs to provide translated materials based on limited English proficiency in your community, the summary section at the beginning of your report, and again, some new language for risk communication and the lead action level. So for CCR drafts for calendar year 2026, RIDOH provides draft reports to systems that have fewer than 10,000 customers as technical assistance. And we are working with our contractor that prepares these reports for us to deliver those drafts to those systems earlier in calendar year 2027 than they were delivered this year. We also are planning on offering a webinar on how to complete those drafts early in 2027 to help systems understand where they need to go through and fill out information. And that will cover these new regulations and requirements again. So we'll cover this also in that webinar, but some common mistakes that we came across this year Some of the language that goes in your CCR is mandated verbatim by the regulations, and on occasion people are changing that language, but you need to include what is exactly in the regulations. In the violation section, saw some systems that either removed or chose not to include violations from the applicable calendar year, and some systems that didn't include the required information about violations. So in the drafts that we provide, it'll put your violations in there, but you need to provide extra information that's outlined in the regulations. But the very basic description here is: when did the violation occur? What does the violation mean in plain language? When is your expected resolution, or when did that take place if it has already happened? And what's your timeline if it has not already happened? So we saw a reasonable number of drafts where people just left the violation as it was and didn't include these required pieces of information. And then the drafts include some system-specific sections for the smaller systems. So leaving in placeholder language where you're meant to include your water system name or contact information, or leaving boxes that aren't relevant and say to be filled out by a public water system. Again, we'll cover all of this again when we talk about the drafts next year. Okay, that's the end. Does anybody have any questions? Either in the chat